Welcome to the first in a series of 4 seminars on alternative data governance and alternative data economics. This seminar is hosted by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society in combination with the Centre for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Ethics at Melbourne Law School, the University of Melbourne, and Jeannie Patterson's here representing them, and the Humanising Machine Intelligence Project at the Australian National University, and hi to Seth Laser. My name is Christine Parker and I'm a professor at Melbourne Law School and a chief investigator in the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, with a particular responsibility for the sustainable governance strands of the Centre's work. So the Centre of Excellence for ADM+S does its work on lands throughout Australia, and in the spirit of reconciliation, we as a centre acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm currently sitting here at Melbourne Law School, which is located on the sovereign lands of the Kulin Nation. And Melbourne Law School is committed to building and supporting just relations between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the state, and between their respective laws, legal traditions and jurisprudence. And we acknowledge the enduring sovereignty and authority of Indigenous law and legal systems. And we particularly acknowledge the role that law schools have played and continue to play in perpetuating colonial injustice. And we believe in and are committed to the transformative capacity of law. Our work on artificial intelligence and automated decision making is one area where we seek to understand and inquire into more just and fair legal approaches and governance mechanisms for the benefit of all. The Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society has been funded by the Australian Research Council to help create the knowledge and strategies necessary for the responsible, ethical and inclusive automated decision making in society. And this seminar series is one of the Centre's project and mostly the brainchild of Dr. Jake Goldenfein, who I'll introduce in a moment. We've created this series of 4 seminars to reinvigorate our thinking about the governance of data and digital economies by asking some fundamental questions about what data is and how it works in the digital economy. How does the law of organisations interact with and condition the digital economy? And how can regulation tackle and transform platforms as markets in and of themselves, not just as market players? And finally, how might data be repurposed as a tool for collective and democratic forms of governance and control? Today's seminar is concerned with data governance, and in 2 weeks' time, we'll have the next in our series of 4 seminars focusing on disciplining platforms as markets. The third will focus on organisations and intermediaries in the data economy, and the fourth on alternative forms of governance. Now, before I introduce Jake, who's going to run the conversation today, a couple of logistics. So this seminar is formatted as a webinar, so only the panel are visible to you. The panel include our speakers and Jake and myself, and also some other luminaries from our hosting centres who've promised to look enthusiastic for our speakers and to ask questions, penetrating questions. For the audience, when it comes to question time, please type in your questions via the Q&A function, which you're probably familiar with on Zoom below at the bottom of the screen, and Jake will be responsible for reading out the most interesting ones, he says, and answering. For those who are on the panel who will become visible, I think, during the Q&A, you'll be able to speak your questions, so you can raise your hand and we'll take a look at that and ask you. Okay, so finally, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jake Goldenfein, a senior lecturer at Melbourne Law School and an associate investigator of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Prior to his appointment at Melbourne Law School, Jake completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University, and he made it back to Melbourne to take up his position here during the pandemic in 2020. Jake studies the regulation of surveillance, law in cyber-physical systems, the relationship between data science and legal theory, and he's recently taught a master's subject for the first time on platform governance here at MLS. He's a marvellous thinker and interlocutor on all things data governance, as you are about to find out. So over to you, Jake.
Thanks so much, Christine, and thank you to everyone. I'm very excited that the day has finally come that we can kick this series off. It's something we've been thinking about for a long time, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the speakers for today. Professor Katharina Pistor is the Edwin B. Parker Professor of Comparative Law at Columbia Law School, and she's been writing in the fields of corporate governance, finance, and law and political economy for some time. Her 2019 book, The Code of Capital, was published by Princeton University Press, and in it, Professor Pistor describes the various modules by which law is used to code assets into different kinds of capital that can circulate in the market. And in that book, there is an inkling at the possibility that some of the features that law offers to assets, such as durability and universality, convertibility, might be provided through technological means. In her more recent article, Rule by Data, The End of Markets, published in Law and Contemporary Problems, Professor Pistor continues musing on this possibility, demonstrating how through different forms of control, data is used to generate revenues outside of the forms of coordination we typically associate with property rights and markets. Our other panelist is Salomé Viljone, currently a postdoctoral researcher split between the Digital Life Initiative at Cornell Tech and New York University Law School's Information Law Institute, and I think soon to be a faculty fellow at Columbia Law School. Salomé is a researcher at the intersection of legal theory, data governance, political economy, and their relationship to inequality. Her recent smash hit, instant classic paper, Democratic Data, I think is forthcoming in Yale Law Journal. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right. And this explores the way in which data encodes multiple kinds of social relations, both vertical and horizontal, those vertical ones being between a data subject and a data controller, and horizontal being between data subjects and others that share certain characteristics with them. And that paper discusses how these realities are something that our current regulatory strategies overlook. So turning to the series now, I can't really think of two better people to talk about this first theme in our series, data. Broadly speaking, the seminar proceeds through four inevitably overlapping themes of data and markets, organizations, and governance. At its heart, we are looking to reorient the struggle of data to produce a better and fairer digital economy. And the point of the series is to identify and tease out the ways in which lawyers and others interested in data governance have typically been thinking about data, how that might miss something, and in fact might miss something really important. The ways that the digital economy seems to be developing challenge the notion that data is something that is simply given up or exchanged for access to a digital service, something that generates harm by undermining an individual's capacity for self-presentation, or something that can be meaningfully regulated merely through transparency rights and the rights to rectify data. The goal here is to take on board what we can of the positive developments that continue to emerge in the regulatory world, while also recognizing that regulatory efforts premised on greater individual control over personal data might not actually achieve the type of control that really matters. So the questions framing this conversation include how might data governance take into account the real workings of the digital economy, and how might data governance take into account the reality that data is co-created and co-constituted through platforms, through law, through personal interactions, and how can we understand data accordingly as a social, a technical, and a legal artifact rather than just a sort of naturally existing resource or part of an individual's personality. So we hope to incorporate some of these conceptualizations of data and find some of its characteristics which are most significant to the digital economy, and use that thinking to reinvigorate regulatory strategies. So both speakers today have recently produced articles offering, I think, extremely insightful diagnoses of the problems of existing conceptualizations of data that inform governance and regulatory strategies. And I think both authors very lucidly explain why the kinds of control over data that have been the goal of existing regulatory ideas, be they premised on human rights, economic rights, or market organization, do not necessarily afford the type of control that matters, as we were saying before. While both authors describe the problems of thinking about data as a discrete object or asset that can be governed through property rights, there are also some meaningful differences in the way these authors conceptualize data's primary characteristics and functions. And indeed, these differences lead to somewhat different diagnoses of the pathologies of the data economy, as well as some different solutions. So I'm going to start with Professor Pistor. I love your paper, Rule by Data, for giving such a coherent and sensible account of the relationship between data and control, the way that it can be used as an instrument for governance in multiple different ways. So this includes, on one hand, the way that data works to control and govern consumer behavior, without so much focusing on the need for manipulation, as well as, on the other hand, the way that data facilitates its economic function, data's economic function, through sort of challenging arrangements that are built into property rights and market-like forms of coordination. I'm hoping you could explain a little more to our audience what exactly you mean by data as a source for and means of control, and perhaps talk about the kind of power that data confers on data controllers.
Yeah, first of all, let me say thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you, at least via Zoom. I would love to come to Australia. I have never been, but here we go. So, I think something that has struck me also working on my recent book that you mentioned is that we have a tendency to reify everything and to use our current framing of things to also explain new things, right? So land is sort of the object that we have always sort of thought of as property rights. And then we have used the same kind of mechanisms to think about financial assets, right? And it's a very different thing. It's not land, it's not physical. In fact, it owes its very existence to legal arrangements itself. It is a promise to future payment that is dressed up as an enforceable claim. Intellectual property rights, similarly, we just have knowledge that we basically give some a license to monopolize it for a period of time. We call it an intellectual property right. And we're seeing the same framing story going on with data. And to be quite frank with you, after I'd finished my book and I turned to the data issue, I also thought about maybe, the assetization, the property rights thing is how we can capture this. And then the question is it mostly an economic right? Is it a human property right, following Hannah Dagan as work? And I ended up basically saying, it's neither. Data is something different. And I collaborated or still collaborate with a colleague, and we tried to figure out how different disciplines define data, right? And every discipline brings its own baggage with it, but none really capture what this is all about. Technological literature says basically data is information on a device. Well, that's not very helpful. I think what we're talking about here is also not just any data, but it's the behavioral data of individuals in association with others. It's really an ecology of data, of interaction of people that we digitize in some ways. That's the data that we're talking about. You can have all kinds of data about other things, but I think it's important to clarify that. And then the question is, why do we do this? And for what purpose do we do this? And that's where I basically say, yes, of course, it's also for monetary gains, but it works not through market exchange. It works through control. It's basically trying to understand what people do and thereby develop predictive power about what they might do in the future and monetizing that knowledge against them.
Okay, thank you very much. Salomé, your description of what data does in the digital world is related, but it also takes on a somewhat different inflection. Your paper discusses how the existing regulatory focus on the individual is unable to take account of what you call the population level effects of data production and processing. And this is because it fails to take into account data's relationality. Can you tell us what you mean, or give us some more information about what you mean about data relations and in particular, the idea of horizontal data relations?
Sure. Yeah, so I think similarly to Katharina, when you start to think about, your first instinct as a legal scholar is to analogize, and having gone through that own process for myself, nothing seemed quite right. So this paper is a long process of me kind of going back to my first instincts as a political economist and sort of a political philosopher to think about what struck me as politically, morally, and perhaps legally, ultimately relevant about information production under informational capitalism. And that really led me to approach data as a materialized social relation. And law is quite good at thinking about distributing rights, duties, and privileges between sort of in the case of data subjects and data processors. But to me, this really missed a key aspect of how data actually functions as a commodity in informational capitalism. What makes it valuable is not just what it reveals about me as a data subject qua me, but what data about me reveals about people like me. So that's sort of the computational input for behavioral analysis and behavioral change is on the basis of these relevant category features that I can sort of contribute to sort of refining as predictive mechanisms. And that puts me into a relationship with people on the basis of this sort of classificatory impulse. And what I'm really interested in, or what the piece sort of tries to explore, is how law sets the terms of that relation, and how that raises things that are, for me as someone interested in kind of egalitarian interventions, issues of political and moral concern. And there again, really focusing on those horizontal relations between myself and the others that I'm sort of placed in classificatory relation with, focusing on kind of the quality of those relations as of social and legal concern.
Great. So one of the ways in which you, Salomé, talk about this in the paper is this idea of population level interests at stake in data production.
Yes.
Could you explain a little more what you mean by that?
Yeah, so what I mean is that insofar as we think people have an interest in information production at all, which I believe that we do, a lot of those interests, I would say an overwhelming majority of those interests reside at the population level. So insofar as we think that there is something legally relevant about information being collected about me, that relevance resides at kind of that population level where that classificatory act is happening. It doesn't reduce to the individual transaction that I have with a data processor. And I'm happy to provide a quick example.
Yeah, maybe a quick example is good.
Yeah, this can get like very, abstract very quickly. So you can take information that seems extremely personal. So let's say that I'm using a fertility tracker app and it lets me know that there's a good likelihood that I'm in the first trimester of a pregnancy. We can really think, okay, I should not, an employer of mine should not have access to that information. They shouldn't be able to, use that information against me or sort of gain insight into that information. And so you can think, okay, we really have to give me a lot of control so that I can consent to say, no one can get this information except the fertility tracker. And if the fertility tracker discloses that information about my first trimester pregnancy to my employer, I might have a legal right against them for doing that. But if I have a pernicious employer, they don't need to get my first trimester pregnancy data. They can find sort of all of these other ways in which I'm similar to other millennial women in Southeast Michigan and my browsing habits, and make a 95% prediction on the basis of this relationship that I'm in, that I'm pregnant, and act on me anyway. So my interest is at that level of like first trimester pregnancy data as a woman millennial in Southeast Michigan. That's a population interest I have in that information production process as a whole.
Super, very clear, thank you. Both of you have discussed the utility and disutility of using metaphors to talk about data, making the point that it's not just another tangible, finite, fungible asset, in particular in that its value doesn't necessarily come from use or exchange. Professor Pistor, perhaps you could talk about some of the characteristics of data that differentiate it from other assets, and you sort of poked at this a little bit before, but I'm interested in if you could draw this out a little bit more, because we seem to still be in this world where property rights and data are in a confused and tangled relationship, and perhaps thinking about these metaphors might help us unpack that.
Yeah, so I think property rights is widely used, but it's also widely used to say that data is not property rights. So most courts in the United States have basically denied claimants rights against data breach or using their data on property rights grounds, because they basically say these data in the non-aggregate fashion are not of economic value to you, so you can't have a property right in them, essentially. So it's actually interesting that in our imagination we treat them as property, and when you look to some of the regulations like the European Gdpr, it also has a very strong property rights flavor to it, by sort of dividing personal data and non-personal data and then giving you consent right. But in truth, it's actually not. It's not property rights, and the same, of course, is true for economics, right? It's non-rivalrous. It's not scarce. So it really defies most of the assumptions of goods that we treat in sort of normal economic models as assets, and none of them fits data. You can have them, they're ubiquitous, they're reproduced all the time, they're certainly non-rivalrous. So I think that sort of drove us in the collaboration with Kopia Georg, with whom I'm working on this, to really probe a little bit deeper also into what data, how we might think about data. It's not what it is, but what function it plays in a particular context, and therefore why we should govern it in a certain way or not.
So to continue on from there, can you offer us some sort of consequences or some insights for how we should think about data governance, premised on the idea that data's value comes from its predictive power rather than its exchange value? And just as a side question, I wonder if this is unique in an economic system. Is data a sort of unique form of quasi-capital in this way?
Well, yeah, it is and it is not. I mean, like it's really about information in a particular form, right? We've always collected information about others, and we also have used information against people. The entire advertisement industry is already based on things like that. It's, I think, the scalability and the computational power thrown at it that sort of gives it a different type of quality that we should be concerned with, because it does create much larger asymmetries between different partners or different actors in an economic world, and it also has quite pernicious effects on manipulating people's behavior. So it has this performativity aspect that sociologists like to talk about. It's not only that data is taken from us, but data is fed back into us, and not only individually but into our networks, and creates certain outcomes. And that I think amounts to a level of control by those who have access to the data And the individual either producers of the data or those who are at the other end, where data are used against them or to manipulate their behavior, have no clue really where the data comes from. I think Salomé's example was really quite brilliant right now. You don't really know what kind of information is being put into the equations and picked up by algorithms that tells other people what is relevant about your behavior, but they can exploit it for their own end. And that, I think, destroys any kind of metaphor of a level playing marketplace, which has never really existed in any way, but is clearly not present in this kind of very asymmetric hierarchical relationship.
Salomé, your work similarly challenges certain mainstream conceptualizations of data as object-like, as well as person-like, getting to this sort of other way in which data is conceptualized in its relationship to an individual. And you talk about how these ideas continue to inform data governance law. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by those two conceptualizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my cheeky short response to this is that on the one hand, you have people who are trying to apply Nozick, and then on the other hand, you have people who are trying to apply Kant. And I'm sort of interested in pushing people to Hegel. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. So on the object side, again, I mean, I think this is very much that classic idea that people have about property, that my data is like an apple from my orchard, and people are climbing over the fence and stealing apples from my orchard, and that's unfair, and that's like a claim of unjust enrichment. They should pay me for their apples, or I can decide who I want to sell my apples to. It's not like that. I also think this sort of relationality and this sort of population kind of classificatory computational political economy that structures data production is also I think relevant for pushing against the other impulse, which is to say data is just an extension of myself. And so, I have my data double out there, and she's being exploited or manipulated or undermined in these key ways. And we need to sort of shore up my sphere of personhood around the Salomé data doubles that are out there, so that all of the sort of traditional human rights that we would extend to Salomé also apply to all of the Salomé data doubles. But as I sort of intimated in my earlier answer, I think a lot of what makes data about Salomé economically valuable and potentially socially harmful is not really what it has to say about me as an individual. It's what it has to say about people like me that can get exploited and used against them. And so really there, I think the relevant task is sort of thinking about, okay, what are sort of our mutual obligations to one another with respect to those conditions, and with respect to this type of relationships that we're put into with one another on the basis of these computational processes. And that's not really a question about my personal rights. Those are questions of sort of political ordering and how we sort of want to mutually govern one another. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Well, I suppose that sort of leads us into some of the differences in the diagnoses of the pathologies of the digital economy that both of you focus on in your different work. Although I think that in both of your writing you see some crossover in terms of what is actually at stake, although these particular pieces focus on particular issues. So Professor Pistor focuses on, in Rule by Data at least, the sort of disadvantaging of consumers vis-a-vis sellers, which I think is a proxy for a much broader set of conditions, whereas Salomé, you focus on problems of inequality. So perhaps as it pertains so centrally to the idea of data as a relational artifact, can you tell us a little bit more about this particular pathology, Salomé, of inequality in data relations?
Yeah, so I'm sort of centrally interested in my piece at thinking about, okay, if we take my sort of conceptual conceit that what we're really doing is we're sort of structuring a series of social relations via these data flows, then one could diagnose the injustice or the potential injustice of data relations as materializing unjust social relations. And so those unjust social relations could be relations of exploitation, but they can also, and particularly relevant for the sort of classificatory processes of computation, really have to do with the way that we structure social inequality. By which I really mean, if you sort of take the social constructivist idea seriously, that part of how you maybe do the sort of classification of women in ways that are socially relevant and that are potentially oppressive is materialized in the data relations that are like my first trimester pregnancy data, and how that's being used and used against me is materializing the socially harmful condition of being a woman with a first trimester pregnancy in a country where if I decided to terminate that pregnancy, I could face serious danger or serious harm. And so if we think that that's potentially a social situation of inequality, part of how that inequality is actually materialized in my life today is via this data flow. And so we've always had processes of social inequality. They have previously mostly been analog. The more we live in a digital society, the more those unjust social relations are materialized digitally via data flows. And that's kind of centrally the project that I'm kind of trying to at least sort of sketch out in this paper and say, okay, well, if we can have unjust materialized social relations via data flows, we can also potentially have just social relations materialized via data flows. And that's kind of where I leave things for now.
Professor Pistor, as I mentioned before, in your recent article, you focus on the pathologies associated with the relationships between consumers and sellers. But would it be right to say that that's sort of a stand-in for understanding how these kinds of infrastructures and control over data flows position different groups, not just in the context of the consumer internet, but in other digital contexts as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I should say that the paper was published as part of a special issue on the legal construction of markets. And since I had just published my book on the legal construction of capitalism, which of course also then throws out a lot of the basic assumptions. These are free market. No, there are no free markets. These are legally constructed power relations, right? And we do as if there were markets. And when you turn to data, then you look at this and say, the economists now have trouble sort of really explaining it. So they're not saying it's a market, it's a two-sided market. Now, a two-sided market is a market. It's not a market. You look at the underlying relations and saying, they basically gain this predictive power over individuals and entire social groups, and then sell the access to that without having compensated or even asked for systematic consent unless they were absolutely required to from the consumers. That's actually basically a control relation. I'm trying to get this information, which I then can sell for others who use this to get a competitive advantage and to push the consumers to buy their products or do something else. So it's basically just a proxy, if you like, this particular relationship for the amount of power that can be exerted over entire societies and groups with the power of data at a larger scale. I think, again, we can discuss is that they're just a quantitative or qualitative difference between earlier dates and periods. I think it's qualitative, given the computational power that you can throw at it, and given the monetizable ability of this huge access to data that is built into the system.
Thank you. You've worked extensively on the ways in which law facilitates turning assets into capital, the way that law codes the world to make it transactable and stable and productive in terms of future returns. And we're presently seeing a lot of efforts, I think, in the sort of commercial technology space to push for assetization of data, not actually just using property rights, but other technological mechanisms, perhaps to replicate the exclusionary power of property rights. And for instance, in blockchain systems, which is something you talk about in your book. The way you talk about data in the Rule by Data article seems related, but the structures by which it becomes a form of pseudo-capital are somewhat different, in that it's not about producing a non-duplicable and excludable sort of token as a representation, but rather it's an infrastructure that focuses on data flows. So could you perhaps talk a little bit more about your argument that future returns on data might be guaranteed through technical infrastructures as much as or even rather than legal infrastructure?
Yeah, so one of the, I think, critical questions that I've been asking myself is whether the data organization and the data governance can be dislodged from a legal structure. And in the book, I still say no. And in the paper that you mentioned, I'm a little bit more open to the possibility, and I've also written other things in between. So, you know, for the legal system, we're relying very much on state power to back private claim and to use particular legal institutions to invoke that state power, that you can make it enforceable. In the data organization, there is a hybridity as well between the technology and state governance. If you go back to the 1980s and you look at the Computer Anti-Fraud Act in the United States, it basically says, you know, once you have aggregated data, so maybe the data don't belong to anybody, they're like the wild animals under Roman law, you capture them, but once you've put them on a physical device, if somebody comes and takes them, that's hacking, and that will be treated like theft. Right, so there's, on the one hand, we put this on the device, that is sort of the technological thing. And then the law actually backs this up and says, once it's there, if you try to get it from them, it is going to be treated as a theft. Now, of course, technological change, you know, moves on, and we don't need the physical device anymore. We're all in the cloud now, so these things do change. And I think the key for the data monopolizers also is to make sure that they have technological means to ensure that not everybody has equal access to the data. And in part, I think we also see this enormous scaling of data that nobody really uses to the full extent, right? We use fractions of the data for analysis and computation, but it's basically pretending that the scale, we have the greatest data set, and if you buy access from us to that data set, you have these enormous comparative advantages. So it's in part posture, but it's in part also exploiting technological means, and then maybe have the law just basically added on, right? It used to be the device. Now with trade secrecy data, as long as you can keep it secret with technological means, you can invoke the law and then the state again to protect it as well. So I think we're still very much in a hybrid world, but I think we have to watch that space because in many dimensions, the data technology is less reliant on state power, right? Just think about contracting. We can have contracts between Facebook and 2.5 billion users, but just by clicking agree. So the scalability of contracts around a central figure, a central actor, basically creates something akin to a state backing certain property rights. So I think, you know, if we think in those terms, then you see parallels, but the way in which you achieve power and control works through slightly different mechanisms than in the legal world as we knew it.
Just to follow on from that, do you see the potential for these technological systems to replicate sort of non-state jurisdictions, even like things like international investment law in this context? You know, for instance, how Teubner talks about, you know, global law without a state. What you need is a contract and some sort of enforcement capability. And I think that so much of the excitement behind smart contracts was that, oh, now we have mechanisms for automated enforcement now. And I wonder if that plays into your calculus in any way.
In part, yes, but I think we also have to realize that, you know, in the real world, we still have something like fundamental uncertainty, and we just don't know. So smart contracts go only that far. Although I think with artificial intelligence improving, we might actually have automatic updating there as well. So there is a little bit of that, but you know, I wouldn't sort of rely entirely only on this smart contracts in that regard.
And I suppose even those international jurisdictions still rely on like the New York Convention to tie agreements and enforcement back to states one way or another.
Correct. On the other hand, I think, you know, what has given me pause was something like, you know, Facebook announcing the Libra and the prospect of having a global currency. Now, the way it was structured was it was piggybacking again on state structures. So these things always sort of rooted somewhere in the states that we know. But my question at some point was whether Libra could unpack from state fiat currency, just like the dollar at some point unpacked from gold. Mm. And so the next thought than I had, okay, and I wrote a little paper on statehood in the digital age about this in constellations, that, well, you know, Facebook and other big data companies are effectively taxing us already because they take something from us which they can monetize. That is a kind of tax. And with the amount of data that they get and the level of monetization, which is increasing, it is not unthinkable that they could unpack from a state currency and say, just we, with the data power that we have, could backstop a currency, right? And then you have a new form of sovereignty. There's still some physical footprint here, but you know, you can also hire an army, or you can hire your thugs, and you can hire a physical plant, you know, where you store your data. The question is, what is the dominant relationship? And we've lived for the last couple of centuries in a world where we say it's actually the territorial nation states that call the shots. You know, that might be changing. I wouldn't sort of think that this is forever.
Brilliant. So I suppose then that this analysis really is pushing home the idea that regulatory strategies premised on market behavior or market failure, that better property rights or better privacy rights, or even addressing market dominance as mechanisms for remedying data economy, trying to make this world look more like a market one way or another, these are all doomed to failure. Is that a fair extrapolation of the sort of tendencies and trajectories that you're describing?
I think we could gain some breathing space. So, you know, two of my colleagues are joining the Biden administration. I mean, Lena has to be confirmed first, but they have worked very hard on thinking about antitrust remedies. And I think we would benefit from them because it would give us some breathing space. But what we really have to think about is what kind of data governance we would want. And I think I'm not a technophobe. I think there is enormous potential in which we could use this, call it a resource, call it the potential, right? To deal with, I don't know, do public health research and make sure that we, you know, organize us in a way that is more peaceful, that we sort of respond more quickly to natural disasters, deal with climate. I mean, all kinds of things we could do in a positive way. And yet we've basically allowed it to evolve in a way that some can use it to enormous financial gains, and most others are the data producers with little, if any, say of how we could actually really use this in a self-governing fashion.
So this for me connects to what is a growing literature about the ways in which platforms, or the ways that platforms operate, challenge the sort of mythology of the Hayekian victory in the socialist calculation debate, that price, as discovered through repeat transactions, is the unit of account that best coordinates production. Do you see data and the data economy challenging this sort of settled position?
Well, you know, I think other things challenge that already. So yes, data in particular, because it just makes so visible the deep structures that we have. And you know, so again, is it a qualitative or quantitative shift? But it's not a complete aliot. It's not completely different from anything else. It's just on steroids. It's right. It's basically hypertrophy of what we've seen before. And so yes, it does challenge that position.
Salomé, I know this is a question that interests you as well. Do you have any thoughts about the way in which data is used, for instance, to price our attention? Does that shift our understanding of how markets ought to work, or how they work, or what a market is even, or whether we need them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree more that when you start to look at, and I really like the way Katharina put it, as like, you know, instead of exchange value, prediction value that information has, it really shows the lie of this, like, price is this just distributed information process, and markets is just these natural things that allocate on the basis of these distributed information products. Yeah, so I mean, I think it certainly gives the lie to that. Are you trying to prompt me to say that I think we should abolish markets?
Up to you.
What are you trying to prompt me to say
No,
here?
you don't have to go so far.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll go quite that far, but yeah, I think they certainly trouble a lot of the ways in which we think of markets as sort of the primary allocative mechanism that we just default to. And I know in a lot of the work that I do with you is thinking about what in conversation I've referred to as market machines unsettle a lot of the kind of ways that we've just sort of deferred to markets to allocate a lot of, sort of socially vital, goods and services.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So I'd like to then move on to how we might successfully manage or better manage data production. Both of our speakers have discussed the need for governance mechanisms that collectivize power in one way or another in order to decide the purposes for which data production and data processing proceed. Professor Pistor has suggested altering the organizational structure of data collection and processing. And Salomé, you talk about altering the institutional structures of data production. So I was hoping that you could both expand on these ideas. Perhaps Professor Pistor, you'd like to go first.
Yeah, so in the paper that I published last August, I was basically trying to find a fix for the particular problem that I identified as the relationship between data producers and consumers, and then the data controllers with the clients and brokers in the mix. And so clearly, once you depart from property rights and contracts, we still think in old categories. So the next category that we pull out of the drawer is organizational law, and I happen to teach corporate law, and of course I'm familiar with trust law, and in constitutional law, I always tell my students, corporate law is the constitutional law for the private sector. So we think organization. So how do you allocate control rights, participatory rights, maybe also economic rights to a common shared pool of resources, right? That's basically what we're trying to do. And so I felt that if we are in the world that we currently are, and you assume that there's Google and Facebook, and we don't break it up and start from somewhere completely different, then how could we enhance the position of the people who are currently being used as producers and very, very often also are the consumers against whom the data are being used, but not necessarily. And so the idea was to say we create something like a trust. So if my own data don't have any economic value, the aggregate data do have economic value. And there's nothing to prevent us from saying, well, maybe all data producers should be beneficiaries of a share of the income that these data produce. And you could hire the service providers who clean the data, organize them, build the algorithms. It's not really clear why the data producers have to be excluded from any economic gain here. And at the same time, you could then also give them decision-making rights, because with millions of billions of users, what you'll do is you don't have them participate in a direct fashion, but you have some kind of a representative structure. So you use a trustee, for example, that is bound by a particular contract that has to be implemented, monitored, and then negotiated with the other sides, whether it's the controller in the current version, but who doesn't have full control anymore because has to negotiate the extent to which they might have control. So that's the basic idea. Others have come out with ideas about trust structures. So Aziz Hook has written a paper, which is now on ssrn.com, about the public trust at the municipal level, for example. And Napoli has written about using public trust structure. So this is, again, like a conventional tool where we say this is sort of one way in which we have dealt with, protecting natural resources, maybe data a little closer to that. And so we can use the structures. They probably don't resolve all the issues, but it's just basically the one of the default solutions that came to mind for this particular problem that I identified.
Thank you. Yeah, I've always thought that the move to intermediaries is a fascinating one, but I've also always been sort of challenged by this idea that when you position the sort of consumer or data subject as also the ultimate beneficiary of the data processing that happens in the consumer internet, that might produce a sort of contradictory set of incentives, in that all of a sudden the consumer is incentivized to maximally exploit their own behavioral data in that context. And I wonder if that's a misplaced anxiety, or whether there's sort of an organizational way around that.
I don't think it's a misplaced anxiety. I can see that, and clearly there are structural issues here as well. Sort of who has the time to think about this very seriously and to make decisions about how data, either collective data or individual data, should be used. And if it's just the remuneration, then some people might just want to maximize the remuneration and don't care about the particular use, right? So you have to, this has to be preceded by some kind of a contractual feature where we basically say these kind of data, yes, and other kind of data, no, this particular usages will be underwritten, others will not be underwritten. And so basically you're using the intermediary as a trustee that is bound to that collective contract about what we want to do with these data, right? And then we will deal with the remuneration. But that is, of course, an idealized version of how you would get to this kind of new social contract.
Well, I mean, I'm very interested in the idea of tying intermediaries to purposes, and that's something that I've been working on with others, absolutely. Salomé, you were talking, you've talked about altering the institutional structure of data production. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So again, I think if you take seriously the idea that a lot of our interests in information do actually reside at this population level, and implicate not just sort of my individual dignitarian interests and rights, but also kind of implicate the ways that social inequality is constructed and reproduced. This, to me, really, what follows from that is that a great deal of information should be thought of as public infrastructure, and subject to sort of public forms of governance. And so, that might take the form of a public trust. I have followed the data trust scene and world for a number of years now, and I, again, they have all the benefits and drawbacks of flexible legal instruments, which means that they're, as a solution, highly underdetermined. So they can be great. They can also have shortcomings. I think a shortcoming of the trust model that I imagine is a little harder to overcome is, again, for me, as someone interested in those horizontal relations, if you think of the data subjects as sort of the putting their input data into the trust, that still doesn't really, to me, solve the problem of protecting the interests of people against whom or about whom that sort of information may still be used. They sort of reside outside of that trust. Some of that might be resolved by like a public trust, municipal trust mechanism. So of the trust models, I do tend to favor a public trust model. But really, I think generally taking seriously this idea of information about us as a polity as something that is irreducibly sort of public and political. And there, I think I'm frankly interested in not, similarly, I'm not a technophobe. I'm interested in equalizing data relations, not abolishing data relations. And I think that taking that seriously as sort of the normative project just doesn't abolish information collection. It just very much ideally, and sort of speaking in ideals, would change the kind of information that we're collecting. I think if we take the full suite of population interests into account, we're probably collecting a lot less information about everyone's shoe purchasing habits, and probably collecting a lot more information about everyone's CO2 emissions and their water drinking habits. And I'll sort of focus on the climate change thing. That's like a foundational reason that I'm not a technophobe. I think the project of feeding, clothing, housing, and educating 7 billion people, not just to the level of subsistence, but to the point of flourishing as we enter into a world of climate crisis, is going to require data infrastructures. It's going to require technological infrastructures. And so for me, thinking about our theories of what makes datafication wrongful or what makes datafication permissible, we have to keep that in mind. And we can't articulate it as the sort of negative individual right that I have against others, or even against evil Facebook company or evil Amazon, right? We really have to think, theorize within information production, not against information production.
I think that's a wonderful space to pause this segment of our conversation. Unless our speakers have any final words, we might open up to some questions. First from our small panel that we have here, and then we have some attendees who have been typing questions into the Q&A and chat function, and I think hopefully we'll have time to move on to that as well. So I'd like to firstly thank you both so much, and now open up to the panel if anybody has a question they'd like to ask. Jeannie?
Oh, thanks, Jake. Sorry, I couldn't find the button, so I think you've gazumped me over Seth and Kim. But anyway, I will ask a quick question, which is to both of the panelists. First of all, thank you for your conversation with Seth. With Jake. I thought it was fantastically interesting and really drew out some of the, nuances and detail of your papers. So thank you very much. My question, unsurprisingly, given I'm a private lawyer, goes to trustees and that model. I know there's a lot of interest in sort of the trust fiduciary model, which I think both of you have said goes precisely to the fact that we as the legal system works on analogy, and we kind of can't think of another analogy, I suspect, for what we do to control, protect the interests of a group of people who don't have the time or interest to do that themselves. I'm interested in your thoughts on the extent to which actually the trustee model can overcome the problem that was raised about self-interested behaviour by short-term self-interested behaviour by consumers, which means monetarising data when that isn't in perhaps their long-term interests or indeed the long-term interests of the group, that being the important interest. Do you think the ideas of perhaps trustees or fiduciaries, although their analogies, have a merit? Because generally what we ask for in fiduciaries and trustees is to think about interests that are greater than short-term self-interest of the individual. Is that perhaps the attraction of those models, that we've got a vision, horizon-looking element in those models?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's also that we are trying to bind them to a particular issue, right? It's hard to break the trust deed. I mean, they can be wiggling around this in some ways, but somehow I think the idea is that unlike a corporation or business where you have the fiduciaries themselves also being the ones who are now in the driver's seat and trying to do the stuff, is with the trustee model, you're binding their hands a little bit more. That can also be cost, right? Because you want to be flexibly in adapting this to the future. So there's a clear trade-off here, and I don't think by any stretch of the imagination it's an ideal solution. What we need clearly is some way to overcome collective action problems and to find consensus, and some agents who will carry the task of making sure that then first of all this consensus is implemented, but also that then the other service providers, data controllers, whoever is in this ecology will play by the rules that are set forth in this contract. And that of course raises very, very familiar issues. So I don't think we get out of that conundrum at all. It might still be superior to what we have.
Yeah, no, I think I would echo a lot of those same points. I mean, I take the point that a well-constructed trust could perhaps prevent some of the more just people looking to maximize individual revenue on the basis of monetizing their data as much as they possibly can. But I don't think it necessarily solves kind of the almost sort of fundamental information asymmetries that come along with something like data production. You really have to kind of have probably both strong technical and legal protections in place to make sure that those sort of appropriate, as I would sort of say, the like appropriate population level consensus is what's being kind of honored and effectuated by the trustee. Those problems persist.
Kim?
Jake, and thank you so much for the conversations and the papers that preceded them, because this has been utterly fascinating. But look, listening to the conversation now, it struck me that we sit here, we start out the conversation saying no one really is able to define what data is satisfactorily, so we start reaching for these other concepts, concepts like power, concepts like relations between people. And when it comes down to it, I'm just wondering whether the focus on data is itself that useful. Do we just need to stop talking about data? Because data obfuscates, right? It is a quite different matter talking about, shoe purchase habits, as you say, versus carbon credits. You know, it struck me as I'm listening to Salomé, you know, there's that question of the fertility tracker and you're in your first trimester. It's not the fact that they have the data about that. It's that that's then used against you. It's, you know, it's not the data, it's the pregnancy and the implications of someone using that pregnancy against you in some way, say to fire you or get rid of you in some way. And so I was thinking the whole time, why is it we keep talking about data? Why is it, and I mean, ironically, I think you captured it, Katharina, when you said that, you know, it's almost like the data materializes the relations. It gives us something to focus on when we're actually talking about these bigger problems like power, like inequality, like carbon emissions, etc. So, you know, ironically, data is immaterial, but it's the fact that it materializes in the device some of these relations that we get to talk about. But you know, I still come back to that question: is it useful to talk about data, or is it, you know, should we be talking about the relations between people? You know, the acts that are wrongful, not the data collection or, you know, the data processing, but the things that people are doing with data that are wrong, or that are disadvantaging people or increasing inequality.
Yeah. No, I think this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we're basically conceding the point that, of course, the data monetizers or the data assetizers have made. Is basically saying data is the new oil, and that is being used as a legitimizing function to say we should exploit it and everybody should have, you know, the possibility to do this. And if you take this away, that's really economically very harmful. So you make that concession when you treat it as assets. But because they have done that and treat it as assets, I think we also have to then create an alternative image, and I think that's part of what I was trying to do in my paper, basically saying it's actually this control is ruled by data. We're using the data to actually exert control over others, and that is the end of market. So my hope was basically to get across the message that if we continue to do what we're doing, we're actually undermining the very structures on which the argument that it is an asset and that it can be, you know, assetized in this fashion creates. So I think I agree with you in principle that we should move certainly beyond data, but it's a particular way in which information has been, it can be captured and computational power can be thrown at it, that in this combination is the real source of trouble. And of course, and it's always sort of the social relations that we're talking about. You could say, make the same argument about law. Why are we talking about law? Property law, isn't it the underlying power relations, right? So that in that sense, it's a similar argument here again, but I think there's also something new added by this particular way in which data is collected and used and weaponized that we have to think about. It might be a better term to capture this than the, you know, this asset invoking notion of data. But I hear your trouble. I sort of agree with that as well.
Or maybe
Yeah.
or maybe multiple terms. Maybe it's not just one term. You know, not data, but lots of things. Anyway, sorry, interrupted.
Yeah. No, I similarly I get this question a lot, and I sort of answer like, I wish, I wish you didn't have to care about data. But you know, I think it is relevant not only how, you know, sort of foundational an input it is to informational, it's the information of informational capitalism, but also, you know, and I think Katharina's work captures this property quite well. It's important, or it's relevant for us to focus on data because of the way in which building up kind of data power and data capital, if you want to call it that, helps companies kind of evade the traditional way that we think of regulating, like climate change on the one hand and like pregnancy on the other. And the sort of biological metaphor, because I can't resist reaching for metaphors, even though I know that they're all limited when it comes to data, is really, I think of it as like a stem cell. So if it becomes you know, if it becomes attractive for Google to become an health company, they can sort of use their rich store of information to become a health company, and they can become a health company in exactly the way that they can become a health company while evading all of the healthcare regulations that we have. And if they want to become a consumer credit company, they can morph that same data set into becoming a consumer credit company, and they can develop that consumer credit company in exactly the way that they need to avoid the regulations that we have for consumer credit. So therefore, for me, it's relevant to focus on the information, because that's kind of the underlying thing that can be sort of morphed or expressed in various ways to act upon people in whatever ways are convenient and profitable for a company, while at the same time very much sort of minimizing regulatory costs. And so that's kind of on the economic side of things. For me, as someone in this piece who's very much interested in that kind of social inequality, the quality of the materialized social relation that happens here, I think it's relevant that it's happening on digital infrastructures and in sort of data mediated ways that are, I think, normatively distinct from the way that we've dealt with the stuff in analog, sort of non-digitally mediated ways. It introduces all of the problems of centralized power and centralized control that Katharina is sort of centrally interested in here, which is to say that a lot of kind of these social constructive processes that are happening and that are acting upon us and that have inegalitarian effects are the byproduct of a handful of companies seeking to do profit maximization. And that's quite distinct from how a lot of social injustice has sort of previously happened.
Fabulous. Seth?
Thank you. So again, just to echo the others, that was incredibly stimulating and interesting. So I'm a philosopher, and I'm sort of coming into this area from that side. And one of the things that the last question kind of led you into, and that was sort of bubbling under various things that you said, was, if you like, the sort of the underlying sort of moral diagnosis. There's a lot of the work that you just described, which is about sort of understanding how these systems actually work and sort of providing a way of thinking through the particular power relations that they're constituted by. But then at several points you were referring to the sort of the thing that provided the moral motivation for change, if you like. Katharina, you said often things like data is being used against people, and that's the thing that's kind of driving it. Salomé, you talked about how data is sort of encoding unjust social relations and sort of and reproducing them. And I just wanted to kind of, and there was a lot of discussion, I think, of exploitation as well. Although the exploitation idea was sort of a little bit in tension with sort of describing it as not really being like property or labor. So what I'd like to do is to ask you just to sort of drill down into the underlying normative concern, and sort of maybe to think about someone who might make a counter argument from the other side. So think about something like in the context of manipulation and using data against you. What if someone were to come along and say, well, all they're really doing is using it in order to target advertisements, and like, yeah, okay, sometimes that can be really objectionable, like the much cited example of the person receiving from Target the pregnancy stuff. Okay, fine. Sometimes it's really bad, but like most of the time, it's just you're into the gym, and so you get adverts for new gym stuff, and that's not really manipulative. You can always turn it off. So how do you kind of taxonomize the underlying moral problems, and how do you respond to those who might kind of play them down?
Salomé, you should take this first.
Sure, yeah. So my paper started as a political philosophy paper, so I feel like I was set up for this question. So yeah, I kind of come at this sort of carrying sort of two philosophical commitments into the work. One is sort of a commitment of a particular social epistemology. So I take the view that a lot of the social inequality that's produced is actually in how we create and act on sort of socially relevant categories of oppression. So part of what makes me a woman in this social place and time is the ways in which that category can be used against me or place me in positions of subordination. And then alongside that, I kind of carry into this piece a kind of a political philosophy of relational egalitarianism. So if we understand the world as relational, materializing social relations, that's the project that data infrastructures are doing, then the sort of political goal is to equalize those social relations, or the appropriate locus of justice is to create those conditions of equality in our data relations. And being a good relational egalitarian, I sort of turn to, okay, the condition of democracy defines the just social relation, the just data social relation. So that's sort of how I would taxonomize the underlying philosophy or sort of moral approach in my piece. What would I say to someone who's critical? Well, first of all, a lot of this stuff is being operationalized well outside and beyond ad targeting. So, just in terms of the scope in which this is being applied, one can sort of give the back of the hand to that being kind of a narrow application. But, you know, more generally, I could say, well, that's all very well and good for you if you are lucky enough to enjoy a privileged relationship in which you're not placed in social relations of oppression. But these same goofy advertisement practices are being used by immigration and customs enforcement in this country to geolocate suspected undocumented immigrants, not only on the basis of their own location, but on the basis of the location of people that they're known to associate with, and to detain them and to send them back to countries where they're fearing for their lives. So, you know, one may not be concerned centrally only with your own individual project or your own individual kind of relationship with getting a notification at the gym, but also think about kind of the social processes of oppression that you might be drafted onto as a condition of engaging in digital life. And one might be politically troubled by being drafted into that particular political project.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that also this performativity aspect, right? The extent to which the data being fed back into that. I mean, you know, Cambridge Analytica and some of the, also the, you know, Myanmar, the genocide there, the way in which people are incited to do certain things with the data. That's, you know, whether it's intentional or not, but it's a way in which entire social processes are amplified, not completely reinvented, but are amplified. That I think raises a lot of concerns well beyond the market. Just coming back to the market, you know, I do not a philosophical argument, but I do a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek transaction cost exercise in the paper by saying, you know, people have always argued that firms only exist because transaction costs are too high. We can't do everything in markets, but markets otherwise could do everything. And now you reduce transaction costs to zero, and lo and behold, what do we get? The greatest control structures ever, right? So then people have pointed out to me that maybe, you know, this is, you know, it's not fair basically to make that comparison, but I think it just tells you that the underlying argument about the relationship between markets and structures of power have always been a little bit misguided. It's, I think, the amplification of this additional power over entire groups of people, societies, populations, as Salomé puts it, that is of particular concern. So it goes well beyond the exploitation of individual labor. One point I also try to make in the book, I think we have to liberate ourselves from the notion that exploitation happens in one particular social relations. It's much more complex. And the financial system, it's, you know, it's not really exploiting labor directly, but it is being bailed out by socializing the cost of this particular financial system time and again. And here we're using basically the willingness of people and their increasing dependence on the internet to harvest their data, to exert control over them, with, of course, then the big sort of negative vision I think most of us have in our mind is sort of the social credit system in China. And you can imagine something very similar in our capitalist market economies. And so when Zuckerberg says, you know, let us do it because otherwise we have China, I don't really see the fundamental difference between the two, but I think it's deeply troubling, whether, you know, from an individual freedom perspective, but I think even more so from a societal, and the idea of self-governance in some meaningful way is being undercut.
Okay. Christine, did you have a question as well?
Yes, I have a question. And it follows on quite well from Seth's question about conceptualizing what is the harm that we're talking about. I'm particularly interested in thinking about the environmental harm. And I noticed you used a few metaphors that related to other living beings and environment, and Salomé, you mentioned the need to use data for climate change governance. And these are really genuine questions, I guess. I have three questions. So one is, what if we expanded our conception of what the harm is from encoding social inequality to also, you know, living beings and ecologies or ecological resources whose data is being harvested and used against them? So, you know, apparently we're going to be able to use data to pinpoint oil reserves much more quickly and exploit them, or genetic material about animals to re-engineer them in a way that's probably pretty cruel to them. That's the first question. If these other more than human world has data and has some sort of rights or interest in its data, then there's the question of how the data governance that is currently encoded we're talking about it putting the capitalist system on some sort of steroids. So that means increasing consumption, increasing production, increasing extraction. So shouldn't that be one of our major concerns here? And of course, that has social impacts as well as ecological impacts, because we live in this world and we're extracting resources under Indigenous people's rights and so on. And then the third, I'm going to sort of pick up on something you said, Salomé, because I think, I'm sure you've thought about this more deeply than what it came across. But, what assumption are we making if we think that data governance could be useful for things like addressing climate change or addressing overconsumption? What assumptions are we making about how we're going to use data to govern who to solve these problems? Do we really think that we can use data to make sure that I buy more sustainable shoes or whatever? Because I think, I'm probably just going to buy more shoes and maybe they'll be more sustainable, each individual one, but I'll probably just end up buying more of them, and that'll be a problem. So I wanted to raise those three sort of questions about expanding our conception of the harm potentially in an environmental direction.
Sure, maybe I'll start since I think I kicked off a few of those. Yeah, so I'm actually a big fan of Martha Nussbaum's recent work on really expanding rights to non-human creatures and sort of thinking of sort of political, quasi-political rights for non-human interests. And I would totally, I think my project is really about expanding the set of interests that we think are relevant when we're thinking about how information is collected, processed, used, and shared. And that might very well involve thinking about the interests of animals, thinking about the interest of ecosystems. I also think we can extend this across time and think about the interests of future generations in how we produce information and for which purposes we produce information. So yes, I'm generally in favor of expanding the set of legally relevant interests that go into thinking of how we produce information. I think a big problem right now is that a lot of our information production is done thinking about the interests of a handful of private companies and how to maximize profits for them, as opposed to actually taking into account the many interests that a lot of us have in the sort of industrial policy, if you want to call it that, of what information we collect for which purposes. So right now, a lot of information production and data production is being put to extractive purposes. I think that if we did a fair accounting politically of all of the interests at stake in our information production, we wouldn't engage in that kind of information production. We'd probably be putting our informational resources to very different purposes if we actually took into account in a more democratic way all of the interests at stake in the way that we're sort of channeling this informational resources. In terms of the assumptions that are going into the idea that data governance can be useful, I think probably the most damning one being made from a climate change perspective is getting back to this materiality of data, that computation is a resource-intensive practice, and it might very well be the case that a great deal of computation that might otherwise be socially beneficial and useful for us to undertake is just too resource-intensive, or if we were to actually fairly account for it, be a net loss for us in terms of our climate benefits. So that's probably the most damning assumption. I also think that we really are primed to think that data collection and data use is really bad because the ways that data is being collected and data is being used right now is really bad. But again, I am also committed to the idea that if we actually want to allocate CO2 resources fairly across all of the nations in the world, or we want to think about allocating extremely scarce resources as we head into a climate crisis sort of world, like water resources, food resources, we have to actually take great care to allocate our resources with efficiency. And I don't really know how we do that without relying on some sort of information infrastructure. And I actually think that information infrastructures that are managed more justly can probably do a better job of doing that more justly than the highly concentrated private markets that we're currently relying on to do that kind of allocation.
Yeah, just to add a couple of things, I think we could actually have a much more decentralized information collection and much lower levels of computational power that we would need then to exploit these data if we were very clear about for which purposes we need them and use them, and have also some kind of a normative commitment to use them in a particular way rather than others. As I said before, I think the enormous amount of data collection that's happening right now is for the potential future monetization and in part posturing that this largest really is needed. But I think we even though we live in lives in times of uncertainty, we don't know when and where exactly what will happen, and even all the information collection will not tell us that. We could be much more sensitive to shortages in different parts of the world and respond to that if we made the right commitments. In that sense, I think we need information. We just need to know exactly for what purposes and how we govern that information and who makes decisions about how to use that. That's the critical aspect.
Okay, so we have a lot of really brilliant questions in the Q&A and a really only limited amount of time. So we probably only have an opportunity to look at one or two of these questions. And I'm going to choose them just based on keeping this particular thematic flow rather than any judgment as to quality or anything like that. And unfortunately, time doesn't trump here. So hopefully we can find a way to continue the conversation after this seminar. And indeed, we have more events coming up. And so we'll have a think about that as well, and we'll get in touch with participants. But so one question here, which I think is very continues what we've just been talking about, from Fleur Johns. It asks, is there not something problematic or politically misguided about strategic reliance on the humanist reduction of data relations to relations between people, given the extent to which digital proxies are, in Shane Denson's words, fundamentally discorrelated from human subjectivity, if we think about the latter in aggregated or individualized formats?
So I guess maybe I'll start, since I've been talking about data relations. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I guess when I talk about data relations, I'm actually interested in us moving beyond the idea that what is of legal relevance is how I am reduced or rendered legible to a system, and how that reduction or legible kind of facsimile of me may or may not miss key elements of myself. I think there are absolutely interesting and normatively important questions to ask about, what is missed in the Salomé simulacra as opposed to the me as full person. But I also think that the reason I focus on relations is that at a certain point, the ways that these kind of simulacra, or these homunculi, or however you want to kind of think of the legible reductions of us that are flat and mistaken and fundamentally ahuman, they get used in the world. They get used in the world to make decisions about people. They get used in the world to deny decisions about people. They get used in the world in a way that socially constitutes the conditions that we find ourselves in ways that can reproduce legally relevant forms of inequality. And so by focusing on the condition of those relations, that's kind of what I'm interested in getting at. At a certain point, those things are used for reasons. And those reasons, they may be flawed, they may be inaccurate, and they may be kind of violations of my inner person, but they're also kind of reproducing forms of social inequality. And that's of legal relevance, almost sort of separate from and regardless from that kind of the condition of that little homunculi, if you want to call it that.
Why don't we take another question, and we don't have to both answer all,
Sure.
since we're running out of time.
From Ellen Goodman, conceiving of data harms at the population level and in terms of externalities, which I support, is alien to most of the regulatory apparatus democracies are using to haltingly deal with these harms. What kind of regulatory form, other than trusts, might be useful, and what kinds of individual level harms should we be willing to accept in order to benefit the population? See species ecosystem versus individual animal preservation debates.
I think we can think about a range of other maybe organizational forms, but the idea is basically that you have to have some kind of collective decision-making process that has some binding power over longer periods of time with some adaptability. But we need something of that sort to make sure that we have a compact to which we agree on what data shall be harvested and how it shall be used. Now, animals and other non-human creatures don't have any decision-making power themselves, so it's up to us to make these type of decisions and make them sufficiently immutable. Many other humans don't have the time and resource to do the same thing, but I think that's sort of the direction I would think about this. Now, our current regulatory framework doesn't really address these issues, but so I think what we're seeing here is that just treating it as a regulatory issue, just treating it as an asset issue, an antitrust issue is insufficient, because the scale and scope of the transformation of social relations and power relations with this goes beyond that. And I think we really need something closer to a sort of basic new kind of social compact, but not necessarily on a grand national or supranational scale, also local compacts, and then think about how to scale this by having multiple communities engaging in similar conversations and similar commitment devices.
So I would echo all of that. I mean, Jake, do you want me to not answer? We can get more questions maybe that way, or should I go ahead?
Feel free to answer.
Okay. Yeah, I would echo all of that. I also think that once you understand the kind of general instance of the problem to be sort of developing better collective decision-making processes, you can also start to differentiate between different ways of achieving that for different kinds of data or for different qualities of data relation. So that might take the form of a municipal trust with respect to local sort of location movement data and local kind of ecological data. It might take the form of granting labor authority rights over workplace information, so that unions can bargain over the conditions of surveillance that they're placed into. They can maybe also place conditions of surveillance back onto managers and on bosses as a sort of a condition of labor negotiation. So we can think of democratizing data relations in the workplace. And I think you can also think about things like a few European politicians have talked about just reverting all of the information that's been collected by private entities into the public interest, managed by some sort of public entity. So something like a coalition of national statistical offices, national science foundations, and sort of cleaning that data, managing it for the public good, and then social scientists or other researchers could sort of apply to use that data for social science research, and that would be something like a limited monopoly right that the state is now reclaiming this public resource for public management back from the state. That could be a trust, it could be some sort of independent agency, but that's kind of another model.
All right, that's brilliant. I had thought that perhaps we could answer one more question about the applicability of these ideas across various contexts, such as there's a few questions about healthcare and one about universities in the Q&A, but we are out of time, and I recognize that it's late for our speakers and people have other commitments. So before just handing over to Christine to finalize everything and say goodbye, I just want to thank our whole panel and especially our speakers so much for what was such a brilliant and fascinating conversation, and I hope so enlightening for everyone. It was really, really marvelous, and I'm so glad that we could have it together. So thank you very much, and Christine with the final word.
Thank you for great moderation.
A huge thank you to Katharina and Salomé, and for giving up your Thursday evening, tearing yourself away from dinner or whatever to participate in this invigorating discussion, and also to Jake, who obviously put a lot of work into preparing and facilitating this discussion, as well as organising this whole seminar series and getting it started so well. Also, I just want to thank Lauren Della Cruz and Catherine Nichols from the Centre of Excellence, who've been doing all the hard work behind the scenes to make this seminar happen smoothly. Thank you to you. And a reminder to everybody who joined us. So this is the first in a series of 4 seminars, which will be occurring on a fortnightly basis. The next seminar will be held in 2 weeks' time at the same time on Friday, the 23rd of April. And the topic is disciplining the market or being the market, and considers the regulatory governance of platforms. And we have another 2 intellectually stellar guests, Professor Julie Cohen of Georgetown Law Centre and Associate Professor Keen Birch of York University. And the conversation will be hosted by Professor Kimberly Weatherall of the Centre of Excellence and University of Sydney and Professor Seth Laser of HMI at the ANU. And you can register again via the Centre of Excellence website. And we do expect to make a recording of today's seminar available via our website in due course. So thank you very much to everybody for joining us, and thank you again to the speakers.